Respected Reverend Father Reggie P. Kurian, the Principal of St. Berkman's College, Professor Ms. LekhaChakraborty, Distinguished Professor at NIPFP, member of the Governing Body of Management, International Institute of Public Finance, Munich, friends and family members of Professor C.O. Abraham, Professor Johnson Joyce, Head of Department of Economics Department, teachers and students of SB College, and the entire alumni, my dear friends who are present in person and online. Good evening to all of you. First of all, I must thank my alma mater for the invitation and the kind words spoken. On this occasion, I, along with all of you, pay my homage to all the great souls who were instrumental in making me what I am today, and this great centurion, namely St. Berkman's College, who made us all rise and build beautiful lives and continue to live the motto of the St. Berkman's College, Charitas Vera Nobilitas, which means charity is true nobility. Remembering Professor C.O. Abraham, he dealt with macroeconomics, especially the theory of money, and I was one of the students at PG level to be fortunate enough to experience the rare brilliance which Professor C.O., as we used to call him then, had great mastery over. Professor Abraham was a Dronacharya of this science, and he had such deep knowledge of all those thoughts from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman and to 1974 Nobel Prize winning economists like Professor Gunnar Myrdal and Professor Frederick August von Hayek, who worked in the area of theory of money and economic fluctuation. Had he not chosen to be a devoted teacher in the St. Berkman's College, he would have had his contribution for the entire nation in the Finance Ministry or the Reserve Bank of India or the IMF or such similar organizations. Macroeconomics is for the policymaker, and it impacts our life, and it's a lot of dichotomous theories. Some of the theories he taught us 45 years ago still rings in my ears, and he used to explain without any support of notes or cue cards or books. At that time, PowerPoint was unheard of, and the knowledge flowed from his heart, as he was oftentimes found to be thoroughly enjoying the way he expounded these rather difficult theories to us in his own unique and charming style, every nuance of which he had expertise to explain at great length. To many of our challenging questions, he would be patient enough to clarify, and never ever saw him lose his temper even once or fail to answer our questions convincingly. The class of 76 had a good lot of brilliant and curious minds who were ahead of the curve and came to the class after diligent preparations and debates prior to the entering the class that made the class so very, very brilliant. I still remember the monetary theory of Don Patinkin and the dichotomies connected with the quantity theory of money. Patinkin used the real balance effect to demonstrate that the demand curve for money could not be the shape of a rectangular hyperbola. I just can't forget it ever. The application of these theories have had no real life connect then, but later in life, what it really meant became clearer in the fiscal and monetary policy announcements and the global impacts it created, or it continues to create. It touches our lives irrespective of the fact whether you are a student of economics or not. The technology-based new age currencies will make new challenges in the emerging world order and will become increasingly challenging for the policymaker in the current context. Professor C.O. Abraham used to stay in the Russian capital of Moscow and visit the St. Berkman's College on a daily basis. I owe an explanation now to Professor LekhaChakraborty. Moscow is the name of a village which is just about 8 kilometers away from College Man.
Okay.
At this moment, I'd like to remember the friendly nature of Professor C.O., and I quote the words of my classmate and good friend, Mr. Raju, Joseph John, and I quote, "The gold medalist And other, our Professor CEO, was our warden of the Moore House, which is actually the men's hostel, who inspired me very much. He was very simple, having always a helping attitude, clearing our doubts. He was so benevolent that he accommodated some of the senior students to share the limited space he had in his room for office. And for all the inmates, more than a warden and teacher, he was a friend. I remember with nostalgia the very celebration of Xmas of 1976, and his message was focusing the simplicity of Jesus' birth, which he himself reflected in his life, and a great inspiration to all of us. Unquote. Friends, there are 4 levels of learning. The first level and the lowest is the unconscious level of incompetence, that you don't know anything about it. The second level, which is superior to the previous one, that you realize that there is something, and that is the conscious level of incompetence, but you don't know what it is. The next higher level, and level 3, is the conscious level of competence, that you attend a class, you study, and then you become aware of what is what. And the fourth and the final stage is the unconscious level of competence. That means at any point of time, without the support of any aid, you will be able to explain things so clearly. Professor CEO displayed his mastery at level 4 always, and he made his earnest efforts to lift us all from the level 1 to level 4. I'd like to believe that he succeeded in his mission in taking us all at least to level 3, or for some of us to level 4. Friends, along with all of you, I take this opportunity to pay our respectful and loving homage to a great teacher and a genuine and noble soul who made this place so beautiful. Professor CEO, we love you. And you have left many pleasant memories for us to cherish for long. I conclude now and eagerly await the thought-provoking session from Professor LekhaChakraborty, as inflation is ruining the morale, and explore how policy can prescribe effective drugs to prevent greater devastation, as the entire neighborhood and the lives of most of us are in chaos already. Namaskar and thank you.
Thank you, Jacob, sir, for sharing your personal account and fond memories about Professor C. Abraham. Now, I would like to invite Professor LekhaChakraborty from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy to deliver the lecture on economic policy responses to mounting inflation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was listening to Professor Jacob Cherian, and it's so inspiring. And through him, the world of Professor Joseph was right in front of me. And, that's the legacy. So I hope to live up to that expectations. And thank you so much for inviting me to deliver Abraham Sir Memorial Lecture, at your college. And it's my privilege and honor to speak to your students. And thank you so much for Akama ma'am and his family members, his daughters, especially Minu, to join for my talk. It's a humbling moment. And as Professor Jacob Cherian mentioned, I will be speaking to you about the mounting inflation in the current context, and I will take you through the fiscal and monetary policy responses that has happened globally. And I understand that Abraham Sir's core interest was also monetary economics, and of course even my areas of interest, if I look into, even though I'm working in a Fiscal Policy Institute, a Public Finance Institute, my core areas of interest is monetary as well. So I look into this policy coordination of fiscal and monetary. And like a story, I can speak to you, like Professor, Jacob Cherian already pointed out, like the old professor, what Abraham Sir has done without any PPT, without any projector or anything. He spoke to his students. So I also try to speak to you like a story. I will try to tell you what has happened with relate to the mounting inflation and how the monetary and fiscal policy responded to that. Let me take you through the analytical framework first. Before we respond to the the mounting inflation right now, we need to know what is the analytical framework or what is the institutional framework that exists in our country to respond to the inflation. So in 2016, through institutional reforms, that was a big change that has happened in India. We put forward a new monetary policy framework. So till then, monetary policy reaction function was very comprehensive. When Dr. Y.V. Reddy was the RBI governor, his period, and when C. Rangarajan was a governor, so those times monetary policy reaction function was very comprehensive. Then over the years, through the financial sector reforms report by Raghuram Rajan, Urjit Patel Committee recommendations, then Percy Mystery recommendations on the International Finance Center. So many commissions and committees have deliberations and they move towards one single objective for the central bank. So in spite of having a comprehensive monetary policy framework in India since 2016, through that agreement signed between the government of India and RBI, we have a very focused objective for the central bank, and that is price stability. And price stability, if that is a prime mandate of central bank in our country, then inflation containment has to be the prime objective. But in the pandemic times, there was a sequence or the reverse in the sequence of priority, and those extraordinary times we had to respond with extraordinary policy responses, and even central bank instead of price stability, growth first. That was the narrative which was owned by central bank in the time of pandemic. But now, with the geopolitical uncertainties, with the energy price volatility, now RBI is quickly coming back to its original mandate, that is the price stability or inflation containment, which was perceived through an institutional reform in our country in 2016. So that's the NMF, New Monetary Policy Framework. And what exactly is a new monetary policy framework? We have a rules-based monetary macro in our country. Rules-based in the sense, inflation targeting. And this inflation targeting is about pegging the policy rates based on inflationary expectations and its deviation from inflation anchor and your output gap. So these are the crucial variables we need to look into when we talk about this inflation targeting framework. And what exactly is a nominal inflation anchor in India? 4%. So officially, we can go up to 4% of inflation. So beyond that, of course, we have a band of plus or minus 2 in our country. So up to 6%, it's actually a comfort zone of inflation. And RBI can tackle that through anchoring inflationary expectations. But beyond that, we are in uncomfortable zone. So more than 3, consecutive quarters, what has happened in India, especially against the backdrop of this pandemic, more than pandemic, against the backdrop of the Russian, war in Ukraine, because of the supply side shocks, supply chain disruptions, those exogenous elements, the inflation has mounted above 6%, which is the comfort zone in the context of India. And if you look into the recent statistics, that is April 2022, it's 7.7. Our consumer price index-based inflation is 7.7. Why I am highlighting the consumer price index inflation? Because that's the inflation by mandate, which has to be controlled by RBI. And you know that there is WPI inflation, that's wholesale. There is a wide divergence between the WPI inflation and CPI inflation in India. WPI is mounting about 13-14%, and this is a matter of concern. And of course, this happened through the global challenges, and the global challenges is not just confined to the war in Ukraine. Of course, that supply chain shocks, of course, that matters a lot. But in addition to that, what is happening in US Fed Reserve, that is also a matter of equal concern. In the Jackson Hole meetings, it was made clear that the Central Bank of US is going ahead with the tapering process. Of course, it's a tantrum because it affects the fragile economies. And if they move ahead with the tapering process, that is reducing their balance sheet of the central bank, then that inevitably will lead to increase in the interest rates of Fed Reserve. So what exactly will happen if the Fed Reserve keep on increasing their interest rates? Then, the part of foreign capital or the foreign exchange reserve in our country is hot. And by definition, hot money respond to the interest rate differentials. And it will be flighty to the country in which interest rate is higher. So in order to prevent the capital flight, we have to increase our interest rate. But at the same time, we have to keep the interest rate lower for the growth recovery process, because in the pandemic times, growth first was narrative. So things are moving in that direction. Then, this mounting inflation happened after that Ukraine war. And of course, the China also played a little bit, from their end regarding this exogenous supply side shocks. Then we cannot wait and say that this inflation is just transient. That's a narrative given by many central banks. This inflation is transient. We need to focus on growth, because if you increase the interest rates, it's going to have adverse growth consequences. So that's a narrative. Then we realized that inflation is not transient. The central banks across the globe started increasing the interest rates, but RBI has not responded to them. RBI was waiting and watching, because if they increase the interest rate, then the growth recovery process will suffer. And also you need to understand, when this new monetary policy framework was envisioned in our country, that time many economists predicted this kind of a combination of rising debt and deficit, mounting inflation. Then this inflation targeting framework and the public debt management, that role of RBI as an institution will enter into a conflict of interest. So in such situation, earlier, when it was envisaged in 2016, we never faced this combination, but it was talked about. What will happen when such scenario will be a reality? If RBI, protects that public debt management narrative, then RBI has to keep the interest rate lower. Otherwise, the cost of borrowing will be rising. But that's a dilemma right now. RBI has, it did bite the bullet, increase the interest rate after the MPC meeting of April. The next MPC meeting is going to happen in June, but prior to that, it was, I don't say that it's a panic response to mounting inflation, but we increased the interest rate by 40 basis points. Now, let's look into the overall, over the years, what has happened to the repo rate. Since May 2020, we kept the repo rate constant at 4%. Then we changed the repo rate to 4.4, 40 BPS, 40 basis point only now. So this basis points, students can take a look into, you just remember that 1% is 100 basis point. So that's the way you can remember basis point. It's a unit of measure of interest rate. So they increased, 40 basis points this time. Earlier, they kept it at 4% for a long time. And this was predominantly for growth recovery process. And we feared that anytime normalization process can happen. What exactly is normalization process? RBI and North Bloc and the state governments, the finance ministry, we announced a lot of economic stimulus packages in the time of pandemic for growth recovery process. But, today or tomorrow, we have to roll it back. We have to go through a normalization procedure. But so far, we have not done an aggressive normalization procedure because it affects the growth recovery process. That's why, central bank kept the interest rate around 4%, that's a repo rate, the rate in which RBI give money or lends to the commercial banks, that's the repo rate. And there are other toolkits or other instruments with RBI to respond to this crisis. And the other, rates, one important rate was reverse repo rate. Reverse repo rate is, this commercial banks can park their money back in the RBI through the reverse repo rate. So in the pandemic times, what RBI has done, they have reduced the reverse repo rate to nudge the commercial banks to enter into, credit deployment or the credit infusion narrative. But despite that, commercial banks always have the tendency to park back their, excess reserve or excess liquidity with the, central bank. Right now, the repo rate is redundant. Over the year, what we have done is, this variable repo rate, that reverse repo rate, that was going up to 3.99. If you take a look into this processes, and the fixed reverse repo was fixed at 3.25, but the reverse repo rate, that variable, that cutoff yield was rising up to 3.99. And now the reverse repo rate has become redundant the moment in the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting in April, they announced a new policy toolkit that is called the Standing Deposit Facility. So what exactly is that? Instead of touching the monetary policy corridors based on the reverse repo rate, you know what exactly is a monetary policy corridor? It's like, this interest rate, that is a reverse repo rate, is now, it was maintained at 4. Then, it has got an upper bound and lower bound, this corridor. And the upper bound of the corridor, we call it as the marginal standing facility. That is an overnight, rate in which, this lending happens between RBI and the commercial banks. And the bottom was the reverse repo rate, but now it has become redundant, and now it's a standing deposit facility. So that's the way the corridor they maneuvered. But you have to, take a look into the articulation, whether we have gone ahead from the accommodative policy stance to a neutral policy stance. No. All what Dr. Shaktikant Das has narrated was that we are into the process of withdrawing the accommodative stance. It's like withdrawing the accommodative stance is not exactly, the neutral stance. So that was a communication, because along with the rate revisions, communication, that's a very huge literature in the central bank, that central bank literature, the career theories and how you communicate, that is also very crucial along with the toolkits available with the RBI governor or a central bank, chief or a chair. In that case, the communication, the timing of communication is also very crucial in order to make the markets confident. Otherwise, if you go ahead with a panic increase in the interest rate, that can shake the markets and that can affect the investors' sentiments. So we need to be very careful not to announce interest rate hike in a panic manner. That's why instead of waiting further, like we were waiting and watching right now, and one of the Monetary Policy Committee members, Jane Verma, has given right noises earlier also that we need to look into increasing the interest rate, because if we keep constant for the growth recovery first narrative, then beyond a point it will lead to the reputation risk of the central bank if it goes beyond the hand. Because if it goes beyond the hand, then it gets into the wage price spiral, and then if you increase the interest rate, that can affect the growth recovery process. So predominantly you're keeping your interest rate lower for the growth recovery process. But if beyond a point, if it doesn't work, and to face the mounting inflation, if you go ahead with a panic increase in the interest rate, that time the growth recovery process can also suffer. So the timing, the way you pitch the announcements, because unanticipated announcements, all these things can lead to market uncertainties, and it can shake the investors' confidence. So you have to be very careful, when it comes from a central bank governor. So these were the matters of concern. Now, as I mentioned, the new monetary policy framework was envisaged in our country it is not exactly for a central bank independence. Fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination was always there. It is not a central bank independence or a, independence we are seeking through this new monetary policy framework. All what we expected through that independence is not the goal independence, because goal independence is fixed. That is a price stability. But the operational independence is there through the new monetary policy framework. Operational independence in the sense, instead of RBI governor announcing the policies, now we have an MPC, a monetary policy committee. And based on their decisions, the voting, we announce the important policy stance of a central bank. That's the operational independence we seek, but not the goal independence in the context of India. Now, when everything is rules-based, inflation targeting, as I mentioned, it depends on inflation anchor. That is the 4% in the context of India. We have plus and minus 2, that's a band. Then I talked about inflationary expectations. And this inflationary expectations, students can understand that it is a very unobserved variable. It's a very nebulous variable. And then you have the output gap. So you can understand this is a way we peg the interest rate based on this inflation targeting framework. So inflation anchor we have at 4% plus or minus 2, that is 6. Beyond 6, inflation is a little tricky. And now we have an inflationary expectations. As it is an unobserved variable, we floated inflation expectations, survey in the context of India, then look into the output gap. Output gap is a difference between the potential output and actual output. So you have read in your books that this output gap in the context of US and native economies, it's based on employment. But in our country, it's not based on employment. It's based on the narrative of the potential GDP and actual GDP. Then this actual GDP, of course, that we have a revision in the methodology of GDP. As per that, GDP is GVA plus fisc, the gross value added plus fisc, in the sense indirect taxes minus subsidies. That's the way we get our growth numbers, the GDP numbers. And potential GDP, that is an unobserved variable. So how do central banks and north blocks you calculate or estimate the potential GDP? They use several methodologies, and students know there are different econometric methodologies and all to do this. And using a filter methodology, whether it is HP filter or Kalman filters, they arrive at the potential potential output, in the sense you have a series with fluctuations or the cyclicality elements and a trend component. So what exactly this potential output? Through the filters, you take out this fluctuations of the cyclicality elements and you call that trend as your potential. So that's the way it is done. And that's a potential output. And it is a very controversial concept. I have written about it. Students can take a look into the Financial Express article of mine, why it is controversial. 2 things. As I mentioned, it's an unobserved variable, and using filters to arrive at the potential can create issues. Second, the analytical framework of the macro policy in our country, that per se you need to look into. If the analytical framework of the growth process is business cycles, and we engaged in dating the business cycles, the ups and downs, the business cycles will not work if a country experiences decline or a drop in GDP as a permanent scar. You can relate to it, right? Because cyclicality means you may have your GDP now declining from the prior pandemic levels or the prior crisis levels. But when the central bank and the North Bloc, when they design the policies as counter-cyclical policy tools, then the cyclicality will be tackled and it will go back with V-shape or U-shape back to the prior pandemic levels of growth. But that I have a question, I have a problem, because it doesn't work like that. Because in extraordinary times, this drop in GDP, what we experience, is a permanent scar. When there is scarring, using business cycles as the base or the conceptual framework of the public policy narrative, whether it is monetary policy or fiscal policy, they act as a counter-cyclical policy tool, will not work. So you need to have hysteresis, as the basis or the conceptual framework of the monetary macro in the time of pandemic. Hysteresis is nothing but the dependence of economy on history, or the impact of this short-term dynamics on the long-term path. So that analytical framework is very crucial. Otherwise, if you believe that there is a strict business cycles operating in our economy, and if the monetary policy and fiscal policy act as a counter-cyclical policy tools, then you will go back magically to the prior pandemic levels. No, that will not happen. Because any growth process has got two important elements. One is, of course, tackling the cyclicality. The other component is structural. So you need to take a look into the structural impediments to get the robust growth path. And if you just focus on the counter-cyclicality, then you will not get the question all right. So that is very important and it's very relevant. So that's why, but despite all these limitations, the central bank is using that, inflation targeting based on this output gap narrative, but we know that it's quite controversial. So that's the way it is. You peg your interest rate based on inflation anchor and its deviation from inflationary expectations and the output gap. And we know that there are problems in tackling these unobserved variables. So that's a way, the framework in our country. Now, you can also ask me a question, altering the reverse repo rate can tackle inflation in our country. Then this mounting inflation is predominantly supply side disruptions or supply chain disruptions. When there are exogenous supply shocks, can this inflation targeting framework tackle? Because it's not a strict monetary phenomenon that you adjust your repo rates and you get the inflation containment process. No, that will not happen. Now, how do central banks defend this? Like when onion prices go up, when the energy price volatility happens, when food inflation happens, which are realities right now. So how do RBI tackle these? So the basic narrative is from this, through that inflation expectations channel, the aggregate price stability they can attain. So how you anchor the inflationary expectations, that's quite crucial when you have an inflation targeting framework. And this is questioned, and empirical evidence is inconclusive whether this inflation targeting framework is powerful in anchoring the inflationary expectations. And empirical evidence is inconclusive. And on one side, Pulapre Balkrishnan and Parameshwaran of CDS, ex-CDS director Pulapre, Bala has a paper. Recently, he published in, Ashoka, where he works right now. So there he questions and he empirically tries to explain that this anchoring of inflationary expectations channel, that inflation targeting is not working perfect. So if that is the case, leaving this inflation to RBI alone will not, give you the results you want to, because this inflation is not transient. Mounting inflation will hurt poor, so we cannot wait and watch. Repo rate adjustments is not tackling that one-to-one. So what else needs to be done? That's the importance of the fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination. Right now, the fiscal policy has pitched in, and of course, touching the excise rates, taxes and all, that is not a permanent solution, but of course, it can give a disposable income in the hands of the people if the tax is cut, that's okay. But you need to look into that policy narrative or that policy steps from a cooperative federalism perspective. We have a taxable, tax transfers divisible pool. And what exactly is the divisible pool? That is a kind of entitlement to the state governments. So on one side, if the central government is increasing the cess and surcharge, that's not the part of the divisible pool, then, they are preempting that tax transfers, which are entitlement for the state governments. So in that way, the fiscal space of the state governments will come down. And this excise, that is also, decrease the fiscal space of the state, because it is also devolved down to the state. So you need to look into that policy perspective from, not only the center government, but also from the state government's perspective, because in the cooperative federalism, the tax pool, the divisible transfer, so it's not only the question related to the center government. And these days, it's not only center government, state government are also equally exposed to the macroeconomic uncertainties. Earlier, you read in your textbooks that the Musgrave classification, the macroeconomic stabilization function in public finance literature, when we read, that was a function of center government. But right now, the macroeconomic stabilization, that's a function of state governments also. In this new cooperative federalism framework, the state governments are also equally exposed to the macroeconomic uncertainties, and center government is nudging the state governments to, go to the market and raise their funds. And these market uncertainties, states are also equally exposed to. So we need to look into the center government and the state governments when we pitch a policy narrative to contain the inflation. And I mentioned that inflation hurts poor. So RBI cannot do the redistributive justice by altering the repo rates. So that redistributive justice, how can we look into the redistributive justice there? The fiscal policy has got a major role to play, in the sense that social security net, that's very crucial. The food security, in the time of pandemic, when you meticulously look into this economic stimulus packages, if you unpack these economic stimulus packages, our announcements were not exactly related to the growth recovery process alone. There were elements of human development financing also into that economic stimulus package program. Like we floated social infrastructure related policies, we have social security related policies, then food security measures. Otherwise, in the pandemic time, when starvation, if the starvation, that counterfactually, I'm telling you, if the starvation deaths or that civil war breakout, then you will not be able to control. That's why this food security, social security measures, then protecting the social infrastructure, these were major components of that, pandemic packages. But the magnitude, whether that was sufficient or not, that's another question, important question. But government has addressed those concerns related to redistributive justice. And this is a big question that on one side, people say that central bank has to look into the prime mandate. That's a price stability. They don't have to get into the redistributive justice. So this debate has even reached to the level of, addressing the climate change concerns. Like, can climate change be a part of monetary policy framework? And opinion is divided, and many economists believe that the climate change that's going to be quite tricky if central bank is going to deal with it, because the kind of distinguishing between the brown bonds and the green bonds can be political, and those political economic questions can be better addressed through the fiscal policy, but not the monetary policy. But at the same time, if you don't address the climate risk and uncertainties, that can in turn affect the financial stability. That is also very relevant to look into that argument. But this is about the political economy. And this mounting inflation, tackling the mounting inflation also has a political economy context. It's not a technical exercise based on that inflation targeting framework. And what exactly is a political economy narrative? Of course, it hurts poor people. And the way government designs a program, it's not related to incentivizing the calculus of consent of the people, so that, in retrospect, when people vote them back to power, those concerns, no. But the political economy is like, what are the policy narratives from the fiscal policy side to respond to this mounting inflation? And one was excise cut. Then second was like, we declared that the subsidies, that Ujjwala program, like energy infrastructure in the gender budgeting, we announced that we provide the clean fuels to the women in the low income households by providing the gender budgeting initiatives in the energy infrastructure. And right now the government announced that subsidies once again. I was about to tell you that the Ujjwala, that last mile connectivity, everything was, rolled back. But now, in recent times, they reopened that, and that subsidy is now on. Like, we are supporting the women in the low income households. That's okay in the time of mounting inflation. So that's the way, fiscal and monetary policy coordination happens. Now, take a look into the fiscal policy narrative. Fiscal policy remained accommodative in the time of pandemic and when there is war in Ukraine. And what exactly do you mean when I say fiscal policy is accommodating? You look at the deficit numbers. So it's kind of high deficit and high inflation. So how you tackle this, simultaneous occurrence of high deficits and high inflation, how that inflation targeting framework is going to deal with it. That's what I mentioned earlier, that there is a conflict of interest when RBI acts as a public debt management institution and protecting the inflation targeting framework. Because, the mounting inflation, you need to raise the interest rate to respond to the mounting inflation. But you increase the interest rate, then, the public debt management, that's going to suffer in the sense the cost of credit is going to get suffered. That cost of borrowing of the government is going to go up. And if the cost of borrowing is going up, then you have, high fiscal deficit in your country, high public debt. And now, the fiscal monitor by IMF, if you take a look into that public debt, general government public debt, that's mounting. It's a matter of concern. But right now, we cannot do anything about this mounting inflation, mounting a deficit and debt, because if you do anything to do with the expenditure compression, that will have adverse growth recovery consequences. So that's why you're keeping your deficit up. And that deficit is inflationary. You need to take a look into it. In the context of US, and of course, there are, literature, empirical literature, which says that their fiscal and monetary economic stimulus packages were also inflationary. But, I don't think that India has gone ahead with such kind of a huge macro stimulus programs we announced, which are inflationary, no. But in US, it was overheating. And, that fiscal and monetary policy, that accommodative fiscal and monetary policy was also inflationary. And, that had got its own repercussions. But at the same time, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, she clarified that she needs to support the ailing economy through that, pandemic checks to support the growth process to recover. So that's a way she supports her policy narratives. But in India, we have not announced any major macro fiscal stimulus programs in the form of, especially the universal basic income or the cash transfers, by arguing that if you go ahead with those kind of policy measures, instead of triggering the economic demand or aggregate demand, if the propensity of the people is to save, if the propensity to save is higher than the propensity to spend, then that demand stimulation will not happen, though you float, basic income. That's why, if you look into the narrative of the government of India, it was mainly through the participation income. Participation income in the sense, we will provide you the employment opportunities by acting as an employer of last resort. Then we give you participation income. You participate in the economy and earn an income. But the targeted cash transfers were limited to Kisans, and to a certain extent, it was given to the women in the care economy. Otherwise, government of India didn't have any major cash transfers program if you look into. Here, the question of fiscal space is very relevant. And fiscal space in the sense, these are the period of macroeconomic uncertainties, revenue uncertainty is there. So if you pitch your narrative that revenue stability is the basis for your expenditure design, then when the revenues are uncertain, then what will happen? In order to keep that fiscal deficit to GDP constant at 3%, you have to reduce your expenditure, and that expenditure compression can lead to adverse consequences on the growth. That's why, this revenue stability cannot be the basis for expenditure design in the time of pandemic. And when revenues are uncertain, how to increase the fiscal space. We have gone ahead with disinvestment and privatization to enhance the fiscal space, but that didn't work. If you look at the fiscal marksmanship, the gap between what you aspired and what you got in that fiscal space was, completely out of control. We didn't get what we aspired. And this year, the tax projections in the privatization projections, everything, it's very conservative estimates this time. So when I say inflation, the mounting inflation is a responsibility of both monetary and fiscal. I'm also equally aware of the fiscal space constraints. But at the same time, if you're reaching a point in which, where is the money? That's going to be the narrative. That's going to be another crisis. That fiscal austerity measures, in spite of, instead of responding to this mounting inflation through increasing the expenditure for the social protection and the food security and other important networks and the social infrastructure, if you ask where is the money, then the way we respond to that inflation is going to be very dangerous, because in the time of inflation, it hurts poor more than the rich. So the role of public policy to act, to respond to this crisis is very crucial. It is not just confined to the fuel taxes or the subsidies related to the energy infrastructure, but it relates to food security, social infrastructure, and employment guarantee. Employment, that is also a matter of huge concern. And this time of inflation, the disposable income in the hands of the people need to be increased. And employment is plummeting like anything. So in the US, they have the simultaneous occurrence of inflation and unemployment. And right now, we are also facing a sort of simultaneous occurrence of inflation and unemployment. So tackling unemployment is also very crucial to respond to the instabilities in the price. Professor Jacob, I stop here and look forward to the questions, and I can respond to it. Yeah. Thank you.
Ma'am, I am not professor. I am just a normal guy. I am a businessman. I earn my dollars by selling software to rest of the world now.
Oh, yes.
So every time there is a dollar fluctuation and my rupee becomes weaker, I become richer.
Oh, this time, that was the one point I forgot to tell to the students about the weakening of rupee. That's a matter of concern, if you don't increase the interest rates and prevent the capital flight, and it's affecting the rupee as well right now. So I can understand. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the wonderful explanations. I'm sure that a lot of people are wanting to ask you questions. I hope we'll listen to them.
So now I'd like to open the platform to everyone, and who would like to ask questions and engage with ma'am can ask their questions. Ma'am, I think I'd like to start with my question. There are actually two. So during the 2008 crisis, what the then federal bank, the US Fed's head, Ben Bernanke, did was continuously printing a lot of money to actually stimulate the economy. And when people criticized it, but in the end, it helped to achieve growth in the long run. So is that a good strategy to implement in this situation? And the second question, even though when the consumer price index is very high, there are some goods like pulses or egg or onion, which are selling at low rates when we compare to previous years or the year before. And why is this? Why is that some products are getting much more expensive and some are getting much more cheaper, even when there is inflation?
Shinu, I respond to your questions or collect all the questions and respond in the end? I can respond.
Ma'am, either way, you can collect the questions together or respond to the questions one by one.
Okay, it's good to go one by one. Okay. Thank you so much for those brilliant questions, Shinu. Your question, you have taken the era of the central bank in US from J. Powell to Ben Bernanke. Of course, he's called Helicopter Ben because, he believed in helicopter money, like dropping money into the hands of people. But there was a strong narrative of, you know, how effective or the efficacy of the monetary policy in tackling the growth. That exactly is your question. And after the global financial crisis, we thought that the monetary policy, we gave a lot of importance to the monetary policy stance for the growth recovery process. And as you mentioned, that was not just one-to-one. And when interest rate was plummeting, and when it was like ZLB, that is zero bound interest rate, and even negative interest rates, then your question is very relevant that how can it trigger, a support growth process. So after the global financial crisis, we tried the monetary policy as a counter-cyclical policy tool, but beyond a point when the interest rates were zero bound and even negative, things went haywire. And what exactly is this interest rate negative? Shaktikant Das also, in his speech recently pointed out that that's an area of urgent concern in the context of India as well. And, I forgot to mention in my lecture, but, I can tell right now about the financialization of savings. When we talk about keeping the interest rate status quo at 4%, many economists, argue that what will happen to the financialization of savings? In the sense, if the nominal anchor of inflation in our country is 4%, but now it is mounting to 7.7, and if the interest rate is pegged at 4%, you're experiencing a negative rate of interest. And what is the repercussion of the negative rate of interest? Suppose, our parents, the hard-earned money, they put in pension bond markets, they don't get even the money they put. And our money in term deposits, the efficacy, what exactly is negative interest rate? We are not even getting what we have deposited in the bank. So that financialization of savings is getting affected the moment your interest rate go into the negative quadrant. So negative interest rate is a matter of concern, and it affects, of course, the financialization of growth, the financialization of savings. So on one hand, to prevent the capital flight, to protect the financialization of savings, to protect the rupee, you need to raise the interest rate and also to predominantly respond to the mounting inflation. But on the other hand, if you increase the interest rate, growth recovery process will suffer. Excuse me. Why growth recovery process will suffer? Because in order the growth to happen, investment, the credit needs to be cheaper. You need to keep the interest rate lower. Now you can ask a question, what will happen to the small and the medium term enterprises if you increase the interest rate? They are going to be haywire because the credit deployment that's going to get affected. But if you look into the credit deployment statistics, even when liquidity infusion was the predominant narrative of the government of India and RBI, as Stiglitz rightly mentioned, it had limited multiplier effects. In the sense, the credit deployment, if that is a major narrative of a government's economic stimulus program, has got very limited multiplier effects because access to the credit was uneven. So access to the credit, cost of credit, these two elements, when you check, the cost of the credit was kept lower, but the access has not happened. So these are two important things, and we focused only on the cost of the credit. So Bernanke, that time, after the global financial crisis, when monetary policy was the predominant policy tool, counter-cyclical policy tool to tackle this, it has got its limited impact on the growth process. And fiscal dominance, we missed that. Right now, the narrative in the times of pandemic is the fiscal dominance. Dominance in the sense, fiscal policy is remaining accommodative by keeping the the debt and deficit quite high. And what is the narrative of this high debt and deficit? Why we are giving a lot of importance to the fiscal dominance? Like Oliver Blanche, students know it's better than us. Oliver Blanchard, the eminent macroeconomist, he substantiated in his work that high debt and high deficit is okay the moment it is used or it is tied for, capital formation in the economy or to reduce the output gap I mentioned, the potential and actual. If you're using it for reducing the output gap, that's quite okay. But if you're using that high debt and deficit for fiscal profligacy, that's entirely a different question. Second is how you finance the deficit. And Sri Lanka, Jacob G also mentioned about what is happening in our neighboring countries. There is a difference between Sri Lanka and India in the sense, if you look at the financing pattern of deficit in Sri Lanka, that is predominantly external commercial borrowings, the presence of donor presence, China. But if you look into the financing pattern of deficit in India, it's internal. So we don't have to face that external shocks or external, that kind of, uncertainties that will not touch us. So we are safe because we are moving ahead with the bond financing of deficit, which is internal. Of course, we moved ahead from the monetization of deficit to bond financing, but it is internal. So that's the major policy narrative differences between what has happened in Ben Bernanke's regime and in Jay Powell's regime. Now, that fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination is given quite importance. But in the time of Ben Bernanke, we thought that it's a monetary policy stance that's going to be, very powerful, and we, landed up in liquidity trap and many issues those time because that fiscal dominance, that revival of fiscal dominance was not given space then. So that was a little bit of difference in the Ben Bernanke's time and, now. And this helicopter money, that didn't work. As I mentioned earlier, the helicopter money, we believe that such kind of, drops of money in the hands of people, helicopter drops, that's going to trigger the economy. But if the propensity of the people is to save rather than spend, then helicopter money will not do the magic. So that's another thing, because that's an important toolkit. It's not only the quantitative easing, it's not only related to the repo rates. There are many toolkits available to the central banks, but now we are not doing, regarding what you call the helicopter money or anything. We are focusing on the policy rates right now. Now the question of, inflation related to, that micro responses, the commodity-wise inflation you mentioned, you're correct. That happens. And, these times, your question takes us to, ask a counterfactual question that inflation, is it a macro question or is it a micro responses or a microeconomic question? Because she knows that point on it is commodity specific and it has to be tackled at the micro level and that build up to the macro. But our policy narrative is we have an inflation targeting framework and that inflation targeting framework is going to control the inflation. No, that efficacy of inflation targeting is questioned the moment you speak about this micro responses of what is happening and which quarter is experiencing inflation. Then the policy narratives and the policy responses have to be entirely different from thinking that the inflation targeting framework will respond to it. That's more of a microeconomic responses, which is very crucial to deal with the pandemic. At the same time, I don't believe in the kind of protectionism such measures, because retreat from globalization can cause further issues. So we should not be going ahead with banning or increasing the customs duty or anything by protecting, that has got its own consequences. If you believe in the protectionism, if all the countries are doing a retreat from globalization and increasingly believe that protectionism is very good, that has got its own repercussions in future. So I don't believe in this protectionist way at all. But it has to be responded, and it is more fiscal than monetary, these responses.
Okay, ma'am. Yes, thank you, ma'am. Actually, there is a small correction. The question was not posed by me. It was posed by our MA economics student, Jisabu, actually. Ma'am, there is another question posted in the YouTube by Professor Vimal from English department of our college. The question is the delinking of the USD with the gold standard one of the major reasons for the crisis of mounting inflation? There is one more question posted by him. I'm given to understand that a large part of the USD in circulation today was printed post-COVID to aid quantitative easing. What do you think is going to happen to the US dollar as the default foreign currency reserve?
Okay, thank you so much. Again, that question, that is related to the way you finance your deficit, and printing more money and financing the deficits. That in the context of India, of course, the US, that's a separate story. We have controlled that over time, that monetized deficit. When you look into the reserve money component, reserve money has got two important components. One is what you call the forex. The another is your net RBI credit to the government. So over the years in India, we have controlled that net RBI credit to the government. And in the sense, the seigniorage financing we have controlled. So that printing money and financing deficit, we have controlled it over the years in the context of India. Now, what exactly is seigniorage? It's technically the change in the high-powered money to GDP. So that's a way students can calculate seigniorage. And that seigniorage is also inflationary. But in the time of in the pandemic in India, if you look into the seigniorage or the monetization component, that's quite restricted. So we cannot say that it was strictly coming from the reserve money. Reserve money was going up. But having said that, reserve money, I mentioned about another component that is a foreign exchange. And this forex was going up. So the high-powered money or the reserve money has got two components, the forex and net RBI credit to the government. That's a monetized deficit. So the institutional reforms were to control the monetized deficit, to control the overall reserve money or the high-powered money. But that didn't happen because forex was mounting. Okay, this was controlled, but forex was mounting. Now, focus on the forex. Forex has got two important components. You have FDI, which is a stable, and there is and you have FPI, the foreign portfolio investment. And the part of the foreign portfolio or the institutional investment, that's hot. That's a hot money which responds to the interest rate differentials. Now, over the years, there is an increasing acceptance of FDI more than FP portfolio investment. So that is a stable transition. If you are focusing more on FDI, you can understand that we increase the caps of FDI in many sectors, including the defense. So that transition is welcome. But this FPI, that's a little tricky because as it is hot, that responds to the interest rate differentials. So when US Fed increase the interest rate, this hot money part responds. So that panic, taking money from our country to the countries where the interest rate is higher, that's happening. That's why, we cannot be so sure about our forex, because now we are telling that nothing will happen to us like many other countries, because we have quite a bit of stable forex. No. How do you measure forex? Forex is mainly to to tackle your imports. How many weeks of imports you can cover through this reserve, and this will plummet like anything. It reached 600 million bucks, so it can it can plummet like anything if uncertainties happen, because a part of it is hot money and it responds to interest rate differentials. So that's a way we need to look into. But those questions, when I look into Indian economy as an emerging economy, those fears are not real, because we have not first open to external financing of deficit at all. And within internal, the reserve money component, and the reserve money is inflationary, that's not quite real. What is happening is right now, this inflation is clearly supply-led. It's a supply shocks, because the consignments are getting delayed. There are supply chain disruptions, and the war that is triggering the inflation. So it is mostly supply-led, and we central bank acknowledge that this inflation is not transient. that acknowledgement is a bold step by addressing that through the reverse, adjusting the repo rate. But at the same time, when that is predominantly supply side disruptions, then RBI has got limited role to play over there, and fiscal policy has to pitch in. But I don't believe that it has happened predominantly through that creation of money into the system in the context of India. But of course, US, you are right. The creation of money, that's what I mentioned in my lecture also, that their, that predominant narrative of huge cash transfers or huge macro stimulus programs they announced in the US by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, that led to overheating. And that was like, but that, she was right that she wanted to, protect that growth recovery to happen. And she went ahead with that kind of a major announcements. And many countries, responded to this, pandemic shock in different ways. Like European Central Bank, they came up with that emergency pandemic, purchase programs. So that's a way, different countries responded to it differently. But that too much of money following too few goods, that theory of too much money in the economy, more than that, I feel it's the supply chain disruptions and the supply shocks and that exogenous thing. And we need to work it out, and most of the things are related to the global uncertainties. And these uncertainties, it is very hard to measure. So the policies needs to pitch over there, and fiscal policy needs to remain accommodative. And right now, reducing the fiscal space or reducing the debt and deficit, that may be a little tricky, because in India, we have kept it as, 25-26. That's a long-term plan. The medium-term fiscal consolidation. By 25-26, we will go back to 4.5% of deficit, but not right now. Now, it's like mounting up to 9, then we control it to 6.8. So let fiscal policy be accommodative, because monetary policy stance has got limited impact on growth recovery process and also in containing inflation. Yes. So it's a little different from the US story.
Yes, ma'am. There is another question by Thomas Casey. As you said, joint efforts of both monetary and physical measures are surely required to check inflation. But what will be the situation when union government's physical measures are not matched with state physical policy? In a federal country like India, where the growth in different states are at different levels.
Oh, you said it. Thank you. That's what I mentioned in my lecture also. Like, in the fiscal federalism, when the fiscal policy authorities take a few steps, it needs to be, addressing the questions related to the fiscal space of subnational governments as well, because the tax transfers, that's a matter of concern, because, the moment you say that we are federal, and what holds our country together is this federal institutions, finance commissions. So there's a major role for these institutions, and the way they decide, the tax transfer, that's an entitlement for the states. What exactly has happened in this federal narrative? You have major expenditure assignments at the state level, but dynamic taxes are at the center government level. Center government collect taxes and devolve it down, because otherwise, there are a lot of problems if the state governments collect their own taxes. No, the agreement or that consensus was that the center collects and devolve it down. So when there is a vertical and horizontal inequalities or the asymmetry or imbalances in the system, so we need to understand that this is not the money of center government, that's entitlement of the state. So the narrative of the fiscal policy authorities need to be very clear that it should not affect that cooperative federalism framework the moment you design certain policies to address inflation, because that principle of subsidiarity, certain things can be taken best at the level of the government closest to the people. So that is principle of subsidiarity. So you have to give respect to that principle of subsidiarity as well, even to respond to the mounting inflation regarding social protection or food security measures or whatever the fiscal policy is trying to design through the expenditure side. And taxation, it's very tricky. When you nudge the state governments to go to the market to enhance the fiscal space, and then you have to be equally aware of the tax transfers you design. And the 14th Finance Commission onwards, it's 42. Of course, it's 41 now because Kashmir is out. So that 41% of the tax pool that belongs to the state. So when you decrease the tax pool, that revenue uncertainty, it is not only related to the center government, but also to the state. So that needs to be, I think there's a huge debate right now after this excise cut. And one narrative is, over the years, government has increased the excise like anything. That's one. And now it has decreased, but it has not decreased decreased it in such a manner that we didn't reach the original position. It has decreased only little bit. If you compare it with the way they have increased. So this is one narrative. Second is, it is affecting the tax pool. It's not only with the center government and the state. And the third narrative is that the food security measures adopted by the state governments to protect the people in the pandemic time, that needs to be continued in the time of this mounting inflation as well, as a protection, a social protection net or a social security net. That's very crucial. Second is, the small business firms and the poor income households, they are in doldrums. And in the times of mounting inflation, their challenge is double. What exactly is the narrative of the state and the center governments to address the concerns of the small business firms and the small income households? We need to look into. If the taxation path is a better path to give the disposable incomes in the hands of people, then in the time of COVID, there should have been tax cut policies. But Government of India, if we look into, there was no tax cut narrative that time. But there was no tax increase as well to finance the COVID time. That didn't happen. But right now, the government announced the excise cut, but we are unable to celebrate it wholeheartedly. Exactly, because of the question that student asked right now, or the English department. I'm so happy that professors from English department also joined exactly that concern, because in the federal setup, we need to understand the implications of what exactly meant by that excise tax cut. Of course, it's not only increasing the disposable income in the hands of the people, but it has got a fiscal federalism question. That fiscal federal thing you need to be aware of, the moment you talk about. And I think finance ministers at the state government's level are very vocal about what has happened. And, we need to, I don't want to jump the gun. We have to wait and see how sustainable this policy is going to. One dangerous thing that can happen is the moment, center government gets into cess and surcharges. If the center government gets into increasing the cess and surcharges, that will decrease the divisible pool, because cess and surcharge is not a part of the divisible pool for the state governments. So government has a tendency to increase the cess and surcharge over the years, so that will go to the center government, but it will reduce the taxable pool to the state government. So of course, as you mentioned, it's a fiscal federal question. Thank you.
Ma'am, there's another question by our former Professor M.B. Philip. Congratulations first. How do you compare the present inflationary trend in India with the inflationary situation since 2010 that was prior to inflation targeting? That is, even with more physical stimulus in the aftermath of the global financial crisis.
Okay. Who asked that question? Former professor?
From a professor from our department. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. This takes back to, of course, the era prior to the new policy framework, new monetary framework, and the inflation targeting. And I don't know your former professor is a fan of inflation targeting framework, because the economists who support inflation targeting framework exactly asked this question. Do you remember what has happened prior to the new monetary policy framework in 2016. Prior to 2016, your CPI was mounting up to 11%, 12%. You forgot all those things. After this new monetary policy framework and inflation targeting, the CPI has gone only up to 6%, and now it's going little uncomfortable 7.7. But we are working it out. This is a way, you defend the new monetary policy framework. But I have a counter question over there. Those times CPI was mounting and WPI was under control. Now WPI is mounting and CPI is little. I will not say it's under control. It's now 7.7. If it goes beyond 3 consecutive quarters, then RBI is answerable. So if you ask me to compare those regimes, in terms of WPI and CPI, that time WPI was not mounting, but CPI was mounting to 11. Now CPI is up, WPI is up, CPI is down now. And here the basic question is the efficacy of inflation targeting. How effective the inflation targeting is, in anchoring that inflationary expectations that's coming from the supply side shocks. And you can quote the numbers from 2016 that inflation has not, been high. But you need to ask a question, is it related to the energy price volatility? Because when we began the inflation targeting framework, the global energy scenario, the oil price scenario was under control. That time we didn't face that exogenous shocks from a very high energy price volatility. But right now, the energy price volatility, that's the reality. So you have to understand whether it's the success of inflation targeting framework in channeling that inflationary expectations, or whether that exogenous supply side shocks were favorable so that inflation targeting framework worked in our country. So these are the questions we need to empirically question, rather than believing that after an inflation targeting framework was put. But inflation targeting, that background is how many things RBI can get into: regulatory framework, the commitments towards growth, foreign exchange rate maneuvering, then your inflation. So it was like a multiple thing. So the economists who supported inflation targeting believed that let the RBI focus on a prime mandate inflation targeting or inflation containment. Let the other things, FSLRC, that Financial Sector Reforms Commission by Krishna. So that FSLRC report, if you look into, they focused on the regulatory mechanisms, which has to be external to the RBI acting as a regulator. So these kind of, cleaning up the process and asking RBI to focus just on inflation happened since that NMF, the new monetary policy framework. But okay, you asked me to check the area, the era prior to new monetary policy framework. Of course, our inflation was high, CPI was high, I do agree. But I'm not sure whether it's a success of inflationary expectations channel that controlled from that 11% now to 7.7. But given the energy price volatility, things are going beyond hand. But that time, that was favorable. That energy price, global energy prices were favorable. So that we need to take into, when we think about the analytical, or the critical analysis of the inflation targeting framework. Thank you, Professor.
Ma'am, as you know, there is a quote of Milton Friedman, the most influential economist, saying that inflation is taxation without legislation. And we keep hearing about people wanting a tax cut every budget time. And as you know, inflation basically erodes our purchasing power. So any government which allows inflation to stay high is being basically taxing people without really passing any legislation. Now, what I want to understand is that government's position might be different, or many of government's metrics of slightly higher inflation in nominal terms might actually help in practice. Can you just explain a bit on that?
Atulya,
Yes.
can you just explain what was that question? What was that punch you wanted to ask?
I want to ask you, ma'am, what relating to the current inflation rate in India, how government is are they expecting any benefit from this?
Benefits from inflation.
Yeah, as Milton Friedman says, it is taxation without legislation.
I will not go the monetarist way at all. I studied in CDS. Okay, we are heterodox economists, so that inflation is a monetary phenomenon every time and everywhere. That Milton Friedman, uh, you know, whenever there's a debate happen among us, you're a bloody monetarist, like the way we used to ask questions. So that monetary school, I don't want to go down that line at all. Exactly because of the reasons, Apriya, you yourself mentioned. Because inflation is beneficial. We cannot say when we think from that redistributive justice, and our country is a diverse economy, and inflation helps. We cannot take that stance because the predominant stand any heterodox economists take is inflation hurts poor. So if we are living with little bit of inflation, we have to take care of the people who are hurt. We cannot leave them behind. So the moment if I believe that inflation is okay, we live with little bit of inflation that's good for the economy, then the next moment or the simultaneous moment, the policy narrative has to protect the people who got hurt from inflation. So that's very important. Atulya, I hope you're not a monetarist. There's a big debate. Okay. But I'm open to all schools of thought to understand the way, the narrative comes from. That's exactly you wanted to put on board, that a narrative is like this also, ma'am. So I enjoyed that question.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.